The 3070 Ti launched to some pretty negative reviews, mostly due to the fact that its performance gain over the 3070 was fairly small, and its price increase was fairly large. It split the difference in between a 3070 and a 3080 when you actually look at the MSRPs as basically $500, $600, and $700. Now we know that especially for a really long time, these cards weren't selling particularly close to their MSRPs. So I figured now that we're near the tail end of this generation and prices are coming down, people are maybe considering buying or waiting for the next gen, let's revisit where these cards are at in the current market. What do they cost? What is the performance now on the latest driver updates and games and all of that? So let's take a look, first of all, at how much do these things actually cost. Let me slide out of the way so we can see the PC part picker screen here, which is where I'm going to do the price comparison. I'm not sponsored by them or anything. This is just, it searches most major PC part retailers in the US. We're going to get Amazon, Newegg, B&H Photo, EVGA, all sorts of places. And if we look for the RTX 3070, and I was trying to buy right now at the time of filming, I would be paying $535. For the cheapest model, it looks like it's available for that price on Amazon and $10 more at B&H Photo. We could go up to around $540 and get one at that price from Amazon. Again, a little bit more at some other retailers. And, $540 for another model at Newegg. The point is, these are readily available in stock for around the $540 price point for our base model 3070. If we look for the 3070 Ti, and again, sort prices low to high, we're looking at $650 for our starting point. And again, it is available at that price, it looks like, at Amazon, B&H Photo, Newegg, and Best Buy is out of stock currently. By the way, speaking of Best Buy, you can get these cards for their MSRP now. $600 for the 3070 Ti and $500 for the 3070. A lot more easily now than it used to be when Best Buy restocks their Founders Edition cards, a lot of times on Thursday mornings, although sometimes at other times as well. So if we call it about $650 for a 3070 Ti and $540 for a 3070, I've already done the math for you, and if you divide that, that's about a 20% price increase, which is interesting because if you compare their MSRPs of $600 and $500, it's also a 20% price increase. Now, I also want to compare it to something else. What is this $750 I'm comparing to? Well, because here's the thing. A lot of people could just buy a 3070 and be pretty happy with that, but what if you wanted to, get better performance than what the 3070 offers? Well, the 3070 Ti is an option, but you could also step up to the 3080. Now, please ignore this Inno3D iChill 3080 Ti listed at $498. That's a scam seller that is not actually shipped and sold by Amazon. You will not really be getting that card for that price. I would think. I certainly wouldn't risk it. These other listings are more like actual official retailers and pricing. So we're seeing $740 on Amazon for a 10 gigabyte model. But if it's only $10 more to get a 12 gigabyte model, I think that's the model I'm going to be focusing on here. And it's also, not this particular cooler model. I do have a 3080 12 gigabyte model myself, and that's the one that we'll be testing out in this video. And again, they do come in stock around the $750 price point. And so if we look at the price increase there, the price increase over a 3070 is about 38-39% to jump up to that 3080 12 gigabyte. But what kind of performance gains are we going to be seeing? Well, you can pull up some reviews or, the tech power up relative performance chart and all of that and see that the 3070 up to a 3070 Ti, they list as only about a 7% increase. And we're seeing around a 20% price increase. And then the jump up from a 3070 to a 3080 is about 30% performance. But remember, this is a 3080, not a 3080 12 gigabyte. The 12 gigabyte model, it's not listing on their main list here, but it does kind of split the difference between a 3080 Ti and a 3080. So it actually is a lot closer to an even scaling of price to performance, and that puts that 3070 Ti in an awkward position. Also, by going up to the 3080 12 gigabyte, you're getting 50% more VRAM, whereas the 3070 Ti gives you faster VRAM, but not more of it. However, does that really cause any issues? Let's jump into some extensive side-by-side benchmarks, and I'll give you my final thoughts at the end. All right, let's start out with Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p Ultra settings. And one reason I like to use this game is that it is more demanding, especially at the Ultra settings, than a lot of other games, which to me gives us an idea of what you might start to see becoming more common, as games tend to get more demanding over time. That's not to say this particular engine will be used in the future or anything like that. Now here at these Ultra settings, we did see the RTX 3070 dipping a little below 60 FPS at times, and the 3070 Ti having that little bit of performance jump, helping it, even that out, be above 60 FPS, although I think I did just see a quick dip below 60 there for just a second. And then the 3080 12 gigabyte, I think, is establishing that it is a large jump in performance here. And it's also interesting to compare the power draw there at the far right top of each of these performance graphs. So you can kind of see that the, with great power comes great performance gains, I suppose. And the averages here for all of them were above 60 FPS. Now, then we might want to look into what if you wanted to ray trace, and at the ray traced ultra settings at the native 1440p resolution, we can actually see that all of these GPUs, including the RTX 3080, actually struggle. Now, this is not a typical ray tracing workload of a lot of games. Again, this is a maxed out ray tracing load in an extremely demanding ray tracing title. So, don't take this as you can't use ray tracing on these. I just wanted to really stress test them so that you can see that I think some people just think, okay, it's an RTX card, a 3070 Ti, for example, that should be great for cranking up the ray tracing at 1440p. And this is really just to warn you that even on an RTX 3080, you're gonna be using upscaling if you want to get really good frame rates with a lot of ray tracing enabled in the most demanding titles. There are certainly easier games out there, but this is representative of some of the more demanding ray tracing titles. So if you are going to use DLSS to try to reach at least 60 frames per second, averaging, then that's what we're looking at here. Notice that the DLSS settings are not even. We have DLSS performance on the 3070 and the 3070 Ti, and I don't know how well this will come through on the YouTube video with the YouTube compression and all that. But a lot of the fine details in the pavement, chain link fences, grate vents, anything with little fine lines and things like that tend to alias. In other words, the performance upscale at 1440p is certainly not just free performance. You are taking a very noticeable image quality hit. Whereas DLSS quality looks extremely close to native still, and the 3080 is able to stay at least around 60 FPS with that. So this is why I'd say that for heavy ray tracing, even just at 1440p, the 3080 makes a lot more sense than the 3070 or the 3070 Ti, just because it doesn't have to upscale so aggressively. Now, you might also be looking for these GPUs as 4K GPUs, and there's certainly some games that they can run at 4K maxed out 60 FPS or above, but once again, Cyberpunk is going to show us that there are absolutely games out there that are too heavy at 4K for any of these GPUs. And, again, upscaling can be used, but we're seeing that the native performance of all of these certainly can struggle to just completely max things out. Now, even a 3090 or a 3090 Ti can struggle to max this game out at 4K native. Notice this does not even include any ray tracing at 4K here. But I think that's a sign where, with newer generation of GPUs around the corner at the high end, if you're willing to consider spending a lot of money on a new higher end GPU from the next generation and just wait a couple of months, I think at 4K that could definitely make sense. We'll take a quick look at the averages here, but I don't think that these are the settings that you would use at all for 4K. So if we want to look at more realistic 4K settings, by turning down to the high settings rather than ultra, you gain a lot of performance back in this game. And then by using DLSS, we can get up to a pretty good place. Notice that on the 3070 and the 3070 Ti, I'm using the DLSS balanced setting, not the DLSS quality setting. So that is one more step, aggressive on the upscaling. And yet the 3080 12GB, despite using the better looking upscale from the quality setting, is actually still outperforming both of the other GPUs that are using the more aggressive upscaling. But this is showing that even in really demanding titles like Cyberpunk, if you're willing to turn the settings down and upscale, you definitely can use any of these GPUs at 4K. Although I'd certainly feel a lot more comfortable with the 3080 12GB at these settings, and again, just waiting for another generation of GPU for some serious 4K horsepower is definitely another possibility. Now, 1080p is probably not what most people will be targeting with these GPUs, but I thought I'd throw it in here anyway, just to kind of see how they scale at different resolutions. And the 1080p ultra settings in this game, I mean, honestly, are still incredibly demanding for a lot of GPUs. Also, there are definitely some people who have an incredibly high refresh rate 1080p monitor because they're primarily interested in esports, and yet might also want to play some single player, AAA titles and max out the graphics settings, in which case, you might be considering some GPUs at this, performance tier even for 1080p. It's certainly not out of the question. I think a lot of people make fun of that possibility, but I think that they're not really thinking about people who are trying to target, 240 hertz, 360 hertz. I think they're even going up to almost 500 hertz monitors these days at 1080p for esports reasons, and then use the higher end GPUs as well. Now, while we saw these GPUs could completely crush 1080p Ultra, it's again important to note how demanding ray tracing really is when you crank it up to the max settings. Even our RTX 3080 is not able to stay above 60 FPS at 1080p RT Ultra in this game. Now again, we're not using DLSS upscaling here because, to be honest, at 1080p, you can usually see a bit of loss of image quality to the DLSS upscale. Not that you couldn't use DLSS here, and a lot of people would probably be fine with that image quality. But yeah, it is important to note that just because you're buying a higher end RTX card for a lower resolution like 1080p, it certainly doesn't mean that you're going to just easily be able to max everything out, including ray tracing, in the most demanding ray tracing titles. Now, I already hear the comments saying, well, Cyberpunk isn't, unrepresentative, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I think games will continue to offer some, demanding ray tracing, in the future. But there certainly are games with easier to run ray tracing, so let's take a look at that here. This is Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, and it has ray traced reflections, and you can turn it up to various quality levels, including on transparencies. And by RT Max here, I mean the game is running at the ultra settings, and then with the ray traced reflections turned up all the way, and the ray traced transparencies turned on. And we can see that all three GPUs are easily delivering good performance, well above 60 FPS. You'd be feeling pretty high refresh rate experience here at these 1080p settings. So again, I do want to balance out the Cyberpunk results just to show that not every game, even with ray tracing, is that demanding. Now, in this game, if we move up to 1440p and try to continue to max out the settings, we certainly see the 3070 and 3070 Ti with some dips below 60 FPS. With the 3070 Ti, those dips being a lot more rare, but certainly happening. The 3080 12GB seems a lot smoother here and a much higher refresh rate experience. Again, this is at 1440p, where I think a lot of people would be targeting their GPU purchase. So yes, there are absolutely games where you can max out the ray tracing, and especially on the 3080 still have a very good experience at 1440p without requiring any upscaling, and upscaling is available in most games that have ray tracing. Now, if we look at the 4K Ultra, notice that this does not include ray tracing. You certainly could use some if you then also upscaled, but this is just the 4K non-ray traced settings to see the relative performance here and without upscaling. We can see here that the 3070 and 3070 Ti, this is one of the games that's a bit easier to run. They can max it out at, well, non-ray tracing at 4K, whereas the 3080 12GB is giving a high refresh rate, native 4K performance in this game. Now, I actually played this game on my 3080 12GB all the way through, and these are the settings that I settled on. I have a 4K monitor, and I just went ahead and turned off the ray tracing and didn't upscale. Now, let's go ahead and look at Red Dead Redemption 2. Starting out, once again, with 1080p at the maximum preset. Now, there's nothing in this graphics setting menu that actually says maximum preset, but it has a favor quality versus favor performance slider. And I slid the overall slider all the way to the right without adjusting individual settings. So that's what I mean by the maximum preset. And at 1080p, all three of these GPUs are once again delivering extremely good performance. I think you could buy any of these for 1080p when you're not planning on absolutely cranking every ray tracing setting in the most demanding titles and be obviously completely happy with them. Now at 1440p, we're going to get a bit more of a stress test here. Now this particular interior scene is a lot less demanding than when we get outside. Also, you know, some minor apologies for this benchmark run always has some minor variations in it. So even if I started out perfectly aligned, the benchmark usually ends up slightly off from each other by the time we make it a little ways down the road to the horse and such. But staying together pretty well, and all GPUs, once again, delivering very solid performance at 1440p with the maximum preset. No real issues here. So really, at 1080p and 1440p, I think all three of these GPUs make a lot of sense when you're not trying to max out ray tracing. And with 4K, again, all these GPUs do a pretty good job. But the 3070 Ti is helping to stay above 60 FPS at the native 4K settings. Although once you get outside, it does still dip a bit below, with the 3070 dipping down into the lower 50s. There's not a huge performance difference. I'll definitely talk about this more with my final thoughts. But when you look at the performance difference between the 3070 and the 3070 Ti, it's certainly an improvement. But then look at the frame rates with the 3080, and it's just it's the difference between the three. It's not a even scaling between the three GPUs, despite what their MSRPs would tell you. We're now in Horizon Zero Dawn, which is a fairly easy game to run these days for a lot of GPUs, and so maxing it out at 1440p ultra settings, all of the GPUs are delivering a great experience here. And yeah, I don't think you'd really notice the difference between any of these, although, if you wanted to be closer to 120, 140 hertz, things like that, the 3080 certainly has you covered a little bit better. I think the 3080 is occasionally getting pretty close to a CPU limit in some of these places where we see the GPU usage drop to like 97%, but it's pretty close. Now here we're at 4K ultra settings, and all three GPUs again are delivering a pretty good experience, but the 3070 especially does occasionally see some dips below 60 FPS. And the 3080 12GB is still delivering a much higher refresh rate experience. Both, the 3070 models right here in this scene are dipping well below 60. So, for 4K performance, once again, I think the 3080 12GB is showing that it's certainly a better choice. Not that you can't make the other ones work. But let's go ahead and look at God of War, and we'll look at this at the 1440p Ultra settings, which despite this game originating as a PS4 title, it's still very, very demanding, especially with the shadow settings cranked all the way up. Now, this scene here is not necessarily the most demanding scene in the game. There are certainly areas of the game that get a bit more demanding, but as he picks up the log and turns the corner here, it's representative of some fairly typical gameplay, and the 3070 is above 60 FPS, although it gets close. We kind of scale up from there. Again, the 3080 having a much larger jump compared to the 3070 Ti and the 3070 differences. Now, trying to go up to the 4K settings, we can see that the 3080 12GB can pretty much play this game maxed out at 4K natively. Not that you won't find some places that dip below 60 FPS, and this game does feature DLSS, so I think realistically you would want to be using DLSS on all three of these GPUs. But once again, to kind of get an idea of the performance scaling between them, as we get here, which like I said is more typical of some actual gameplay, we see the 3070s dipping into the 40s, upper and lower, whereas the 3080 12GB is still able to sit there right at 60 FPS. So you're certainly getting more 4K performance there out of the 3080. But like I said, I think realistically these GPUs would probably be at least going down to DLSS quality to play this game. And we're seeing here that, again, with all of them set to even settings, 4K Ultra DLSS quality, the 3070 is doing a better job staying above 60 FPS now. The 3070 Ti is a lot more comfortable. The 3080 is well up there. But let's once again take a look as we turn this corner, which, like I said, is not unreasonable to represent performance throughout a large chunk of the game. We do see the base model 3070 dipping below 60 FPS here, so you'd probably want to turn down the shadows or use a more aggressive DLSS. Now let's take a look at Forza Horizon 5, and this is 1440p at the extreme settings. This game has a temporal anti-aliasing now, but it's not part of the extreme preset, so I chose to leave it off to keep it consistent with the presets, but just pointing that out, just as kind of a side note. Once again, all three GPUs are delivering very solid 1440p performance, but then again, as we look at the scaling between them, we're seeing a much larger, percentage jump going from the 3070 Ti up to the 3080 than we do see from the 3070 to the 3070 Ti. Now, this is the 4K extreme settings. I believe I've mislabeled that in the video here, so my apologies. This is 4K extreme, not 1440p extreme. I might be able to fix that in editing, or we'll see. But for now, while I'm doing my voiceover, it's mislabeled. Anyway, the 3070 is occasionally dipping below 60 FPS, although on a variable refresh rate screen, you'd still feel just fine playing the game. Whereas the 3080 is once again delivering a high refresh rate experience, once again establishing that the 3080 is certainly the stronger 4K option. Well, I think this side-by-side comparison confirms a lot of the initial impressions and what we saw in initial reviews. The 3070 Ti is certainly faster than the RTX 3070 base model, but in most situations, it doesn't seem like a mind-blowing difference, and a slight tweak to graphics settings or something like that, or even an overclock, could accomplish much of the same difference. Now, jumping up to the 3080 12GB, we're seeing a much more significant performance gain. So if you're looking for significantly more performance than what an RTX 3070 offers, jumping up to that RTX 3080 12GB is certainly more compelling in giving you an actual noticeable difference in performance. I think especially when you're trying to use ray tracing, the 3080 12GB showed off its performance gains there significantly compared to the other cards. And then also especially if you're trying to run 4K without as many compromises to the graphics, either through extremely aggressive upscaling or turning down some settings. Now, again, though, these aren't the only 3 cards on the market, and we will be having new GPUs coming out soon. So what does that mean? Well, I mean, I do think you'll be able to get more performance for less money, in a few months, or possibly, same performance for less money, or more performance for the same money, however you want to look at it, in all of these situations. Also, these aren't the only 3 cards to actually compare. So what if you'd be willing to consider AMD? Well, I've already done a whole separate video on that, but let's pop back in here to PC Part Picker for just a second, which is just to point out that the RX 6800, especially the XT version, especially if you're willing to factor in a bit of a $20 mail-in rebate here, but even without that, the 6800 XT is actually about the same price, if not cheaper, than the 3070 Ti model. And I've already done a side-by-side comparison of those 2 GPUs with a lot more of my full thoughts on compromises between AMD and NVIDIA, what about ray tracing, all of those types of things. So feel free to check out that video because the 6800 XT is going to be getting you a lot of performance, and I've even done a good video comparing it against the 3080 12GB. And as we can see here in the current market, these are significantly less expensive than the 3080 12GB. Now, like I said, you could just go ahead and wait. Now, should you wait? Well, it's a different answer for different people. If you wait, you don't have a GPU upgrade right now. So if it's worth it to you to, just spend a bit of money now and your value will depreciate soon, and you're okay with that in order to have something now, it's not a ridiculous option. Although I probably would recommend topping out at around this $600 to $700 price point with the 3080, the Ti versions, other than this kind of scam one, jumping up, we're getting close to $900, and then the 3090s really getting kind of silly at over $1,000. I think those are the places where you're going to see a lot of buyer's remorse if you bought in at that price point, especially when we see that if you look at the performance of a 3080, and this is the 10 gigabyte model even, compared to the 3080 Ti and the 3090, the performance gains aren't massive for the amount of money you're spending there, and I think the depreciation on these is going to be coming hard and fast as we get in the next generation of GPUs here. Now, I think it especially matters if you're buying at 4K, because as we saw, well, the 3080 12GB is a very good 4K graphics card. It's going to struggle at the most demanding settings, and usually ray tracing, at least at very aggressive settings, is going to be a bit of a no-go at 4K if you want to maintain high frame rates without upscaling into oblivion and losing some of your image quality that way. So I think if you're looking for high performance 4K and are looking at this high-end price point, waiting a few months to get the next gen GPUs does make a lot of sense. If you're trying to just buy something you're happy with for 1440p performance, grabbing a 3080 right now could make sense as long as you're just accepting the fact that it's going to depreciate at least probably a couple $100 soon, as we would expect the 4070 to come in at less, a lower cost than this, at least once the price settles, and probably should be delivering better performance than the 3080. Current rumors are putting it up closer to a 3090 or 3090 Ti, coming from a 4070, which, okay, what would we expect that price point to be? Well, if we're seeing that the 3070s are costing around $535 and 3070 Ti's are in that $650 price range, I think expecting the 4070 to fall somewhere in that price range once its price settles wouldn't be completely unreasonable to expect, but predicting the future is always a bit of a guess. So if you'd be getting better than 3080 performance for, this 600 or so price point soon-ish, if the prospect of that happening is completely demoralizing to you, then maybe you shouldn't buy the 3080 right now. And you question if upgrading right now makes sense. If you already have a GPU that you can live with, maybe just live with that and wait for the prices to come down a bit more. But if you want to have something now for a couple of months, you're willing to pay that premium, that's certainly something that you could consider. I feel like I'm just kind of repeating myself at this point, so I'm going to let all you go. Have an excellent day.